Constitution. Today, we have an opportunity to take a look at James Garfield and the civil service system. You know, there's a lot of conversation going on right now about federal workers and who they are and what they do and how they're chosen and selected and supported. And one of the things that we look at is the civil service system. So it seemed appropriate to put that civil service system in a context. And that led us to a conversation about President James Garfield, who was really a dark horse candidate. He was not the person who was expected to become the nominee, much less the president. And we are able today to have a conversation about a book called Dark Horse, The Surprise Election and Political Murder of President James A. Garfield. In his book, author Ken Ackerman explores the creation of the civil service system, what it is, how it functions, the story behind its creation, and its evolution over the years. President Garfield was very much a creature of Capitol Hill. He held virtually every key leadership post in the House, and those years were arguably the happiest years of his life. As a Senate staffer himself in the 1970s, Ken Ackerman had the unique opportunity of being one of the lead committee counsels on the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, which led him to create this book about Garfield that gave him a deeper understanding of history. Today's speaker, Ken Ackerman, joins us. Ken, you can turn your camera on now because we're talking about you. Ken Ackerman is a writer and attorney in Washington, D.C. And since the 1970s, he has been a longtime veteran of senior positions in both government and private law. As a writer, Ken authored dozens of articles and posts along with 5 books on Americana. When not writing, Ken practices law in Washington at Olson, where Frank Wita Tersman Motz specializes in agricultural risk management. Along the way, he served as legal counsel to 2 United States Senate committees, the Government Affairs under then Senator Charles Percy, a Republican from Illinois, and Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry under then Chairman Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat of Vermont. So we have a bipartisan speaker today. During the administration of Bill Clinton, he headed the United States Agriculture's Department of Federal Crop Insurance. And earlier, he was involved with legal positions at the U.S. Commodities Future Trading. During his varied career, Ken has testified before dozens of congressional hearings, has investigated issues ranging from the 1979 to 80 silver corner to the 1987 stock crash, and developed legislation on topics from budget reconciliation to farm policy to electronic eavesdropping to civil service reform to financial market oversight. So shall we say he's a Renaissance man? He's appeared often before Congress, the media, and public groups, and we are so grateful that he is giving us his time and talent to give us a sense of President Garfield, civil service. What do we learn about that system, and what might we need to know as we face the challenges of today? As is our practice, Ken will make his presentation. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and when he's done, I'll field those questions back and forth to you. I noticed someone asked, is this being recorded? Yes, sir, it is being recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel and on our website, available for use at any time. So if you find this conversation compelling, please do share it with your friends and neighbors. We do these as a way to establish public history in the public domain. So Ken, Tell us about President Garfield and civil service. Take it away.
Okay, well, Jane, thank you very much for that very nice introduction. Excuse me, and thank you to the United States Capitol Historical Society for giving me the chance to do this webinar. I'm going to share my screen very quickly. I hope this works.
We know it worked. It worked during.
Okay, here it is. So thank you, everyone, and thank all of you who are tuning in for taking time out of your day today to listen. So this is the book that I wrote about James Garfield. It's called Dark Horse. This book came out in 2003. That's about 20 years ago. It makes you feel a little bit old. Over the years, James Garfield has been one of the lesser known presidents. He served from 1881 until 1881. He was shot by an assassin 4 months into his term. He died about 2 months after that. That's 6 months altogether. If you look at any of the presidential polls, these polls done by historians ranking the presidents, Garfield falls pretty much in the middle, around number 30. Even though his 4 months are generally considered pretty good, he was cut so short that nobody really knows how his term would have worked out had he had the chance to complete it. What I'm going to do, though, is something a little bit different. You've had speakers before talk about James Garfield and his life and times. What I'm going to talk about is specifically his role in the creation of the civil service system. As a result, I'm going to tell you a kind of roundabout story. So sit back, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. So as Jane mentioned, my first job in Washington was on Capitol Hill, was working for the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs. Here you see a picture of me around 1976, 77. I was in my mid-20s. This is what people looked like back in the 1970s, for those of you who have tried very hard to forget our bad style choices. But I had come to Washington for law school in 1973. I got a job during law school working for the Senate Committee on Governmental Affairs. That's what it was called back then. It was an interesting time to be on that committee. The committee had just produced what became the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Act, very much in the news today. The committee had also just produced the bills to create the Energy and Education departments, also very much in the news today. And it also dealt with many of the post-Watergate reforms. For me, as the low person on the totem pole, I was basically assigned all of the issues that nobody else really wanted to deal with. And one of those was civil service. And it was during this time in 1978 that President Jimmy Carter decided to make civil service a major initiative for his term. He sent up to Congress what would become the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, which landed squarely on my desk. As a result, I had a very unique professional opportunity to be the lead, one of the lead committee counsels on this bill for the Republican side, all the ways through, from introduction to hearings to the Senate floor, to a conference committee, to the bill being signed into law, all within 1 year. The gentleman you see me standing with was my boss during that time, Senator Chuck Percy. He was a Republican from Illinois, a liberal progressive Republican. There were quite a few of those back then, a very good senator. He was the ranking member of our committee, the Governmental Affairs Committee. The Civil Service Bill took the old Civil Service Commission and replaced it with the modern Office of Personnel Management, the Merit Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel. It created the Senior Executive Service and created many of the adverse action procedures under law. The bill was signed into law in October. It was very popular, I'm happy to say. Here you see the signing ceremony. That's Jimmy Carter in the middle, having just signed the bill. That's Chuck Percy standing behind him to his, I guess it would be to your right. Right behind President Carter is Abe Ribicoff, Democrat from Connecticut, who is the committee chairman. Next to him is Jacob Javits, another liberal progressive Republican from New York, who was one of the senior members of the committee. And behind him, Sam Nunn. The thing that I remember from that year is as the staff counsel, as the staff gopher, if you will, during that year, I wrote dozens, almost hundreds of speeches and memos and reports and letters, all with almost word for word the same sentence in the first or second paragraph. This is the most important reform since 1883, when a disappointed office seeker named Charles Guiteau shot President Garfield, prompting Congress to enact the Pendleton Act of 1883. Those words were etched into my memory, and I was left very curious, wanting to know what was behind them. I won't bury the lead. This is Charles Guiteau, a cartoon version of him. He's holding a sign saying "An office of or your life." That's the classic view of him as the disappointed office seeker. He shot James Garfield in Washington, D.C. at the train station, what was the old Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, which was torn down many years ago. It's now on the site of the National Gallery of Art. The shooting took place on a Saturday morning, July 2nd, 1881, about 9:30 in the morning, as Garfield was getting ready to get on a train to go on vacation. Garfield died about 2 months later in September 1881. The Civil Service Act was passed in 1883, signed into law. And for the next 142 years, this was considered one of the basic firmaments of our governmental system. A very popular law, something that had wide support. Our changes in 1978 were important, but they were intended to preserve the system, preserve the fundamental system as it existed. So it came as a bit of a surprise to me over the past few months to see just how controversial the civil service had suddenly become. Now, one word right up front, I'm not here to talk politics. That's not my job today. Whether you think the current administration, the Doge group, the changes they're making in federal employment are a good idea or a bad idea, there are strong feelings on all sides. This is an issue that Congress is going to be debating for certainly all of this year and probably for the next several years. Many people think it's something like this is long overdue. Others think it's being handled in a poor way, but that's not for my discussion. The changes so far have been dramatic. One of the first things that the new administration did was to fire the chairman of the Merit Protection Board and the special counsel, despite the fact that the statute says clearly that they can only be fired for cause or malfeasance. This is being done, obviously, to create a test case for the Supreme Court on the extent of presidential authority over regulatory agencies. Some 70-odd thousand people, federal employees at this point, have been either fired or placed on probation or administrative leave or have taken various forms of buyouts. There are many lawsuits at this point at various points of review. How this will play out, the jury is still out. And as I say, we'll be watching this unfold for many years. What I'm going to talk about today is about where the civil service comes from, why it exists, and the role of James Garfield in that discussion. To make sense of this, I'm going to have to tell you a little bit of backstory, tell you some things we don't usually cover in a Garfield discussion, how Garfield came onto the scene, and how the civil service itself, the spoils system, became such a hot button issue in America. So to make sense of this, we have to go back to the beginning. Here you see the famous painting of the summer of 1787, the Constitutional Convention. That's George Washington up front and the chairman's standing at the chairman's chair, Benjamin Franklin in the middle. This painting is hanging on the House side of the Capitol building. The Constitutional Convention created three branches of government: the Congress, the judiciary, and the executive. The very first president, President Washington, and the very first Congress in its very first year, 1789, started creating the federal bureaucracy. They created 5 departments: state, war, justice, treasury, and the post office. For the first 40 years of the country, this system was very stable. Over time, by the 1820s, It had grown to approximately about 8 to 10,000 government employees, mostly in Washington, but spread around the country. When parties changed, when new administrations came and went, very few employees left their jobs. People stayed in their positions. The new president would bring in new cabinet members, but those 8 to 10,000 federal employees largely stayed the same. One reason for that was that for 28 years, from 1800 to 1828, we had one political party, the Democratic Republicans, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, John Quincy Adams. So when a new president came in, there was little change. All of that changed abruptly in 1828 when this man was elected president. This is Andrew Jackson, a very popular man at the time, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans from 1814. Today, he's considered a very controversial president for a number of reasons, but I'll try to avoid getting into the controversies. He had been elected in a very bitter campaign against John Quincy Adams, who was the incumbent. He accused John Quincy Adams of cheating him out of the election 4 years earlier in what he called a corrupt bargain with Henry Clay. He painted Adams as an intellectual elite. Jackson painted himself as the representative of the common people, workers, immigrants, frontier settlers, versus the big city banks and the big city elites. He was the first populist founder of the Democratic Party. One of the more important things, and for our purposes, striking things that he did almost immediately in his term, though, is that he fired about 10% of those federal employees, those 8 to 10,000 federal employees, and he replaced them with loyalists, people who were loyal to him. This was shocking because it's the first time anyone had done it. Within the Washington community, where many of those people lived, it was considered very disruptive. But at the time, it was considered also something of a reform. Elections have consequences, and if a new president has a new point of view, new policies, they ought to be able to put people who believe in those policies into the top offices. Over time, the system became very corrupt, as we're going to talk about in a minute. This cartoon was drawn in the 1870s, many years later, after the system had, that corruption had become very clear and explicit and unavoidable. This cartoon is based on the statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Park. You can see the horse has turned into a pig, scurrying or digging into plunder and bribery and fraud. To the victors belong the spoils, was the motto. It's attributed to Jackson, but actually the words were said by somebody else, one of his followers named William Marcy, the governor of New York State. After Andrew Jackson, this system proceeded. The size of the government stayed relatively stable until the Civil War, when it exploded. Just the civilian part of the federal workforce grew from around 10,000 to over 80,000, just in a very short period of time. After the Civil War, it stayed at this level. And again, even after the Army demilitarized after the Civil War, there remained over 80,000 federal employees, Treasury officials, postal workers, clerks, collectors, military, civilian bureaucrats. Every one of these 80-odd thousand federal employees was a political appointee, all chosen by the leaders, by the president and the members of Congress. The patronage system, the control of patronage, became the currency of politics, much as money is, political contributions are today. Every congressman and senator insisted on controlling the federal patronage within their state or their district. There were reasons for this. Every one of those 80-odd thousand federal employees was expected to take 5 to 10% of their salary and contribute it as a kickback to the politicians who got them their jobs. This became the main funding mechanism for the political parties and became something that was fought over. After every election, large crowds of office seekers besieged not only the president, but also the congressmen and senators trying to get jobs. The system was institutionalized by practices, for instance, in the Senate, something called senatorial courtesy. The president could not appoint anyone and have that appointment confirmed by the Senate unless it was approved by the senior senator from that state of that party. Over time, the system became riddled with abuse and corruption. By our period, the James Garfield period that we'll be talking about, the poster child for that corruption, one of the main locations of that corruption, was this building in New York City. It's the old Merchants Exchange Bank, but in 1863, during the Civil War, this building was taken over by the federal government and became home to the New York Customhouse. This is the office that collects all of the tariff duties for all of the material, all of the goods that come into the port of New York. Now, to understand this, it's important to note that before 1913, there was no income tax in America. The government was financed primarily through tariffs. This is a concept we hear talked about recently. Here I'm going to show you a little bit about what happened when it existed in reality. There was no income tax. The main source were tariffs and customs. They provided about 3/4 to 80% of the funding of the government. The rest was provided by various excise taxes. And about 80% of the tariffs came in through New York Harbor. In the late 1880s, late 1870s, that totaled over $100 million in customs per year, an enormous amount of money in modern terms. Not only was the Customs House one of the most important financial institutions in the country, but was also one of the most important political institutions in the country. It employed over 1,000 people. Every one of them was a political appointee. So it was the largest patronage prize in the country. And for years, it was controlled by the New York State political machine of whatever party was in power. From the Civil War through the 1870s and 1880s, that was the Republican Party. Every one of those 1,000 employees paid 5 to 10% of their salary as a kickback to the state party. That's how the party was funded. Every one of them was expected to participate in elections and electioneering whenever a campaign came up every 2 years. Money corrupts, money attracts corruption. Over time, this custom house became notorious for kickbacks and briberies and favoritism. This is what it looked like to have to go through customs back in the 1870s if you were coming into New York City on a ship. Any one of you who's had a bad experience coming in through Kennedy Airport or BWI or Dulles going through customs can appreciate this scene, only take the stress level and increase it several fold. Imagine what it would be like getting off of a plane or getting off of a ship at sea for several weeks, going through customs, knowing that if you want your baggage approved, you might have to pay a bribe to the customs inspector. That was normal. If you had a big shipment and you wanted to make sure it got through customs quickly, you might have to make a large payoff to the politicians. That was considered normal. That was the New York Customs House. That was the spoil system. As you might imagine, the person who ran the Customs House, who was called the collector, this was arguably the best job in the country, or one of the best jobs in the country. For one thing, the salary was very large. The collector was paid $12,000 a year in base salary. That's about $400,000 today. Plus, they got special fees based on the amount of goods that went through the harbor. Those fees could add up to about $50,000. And again, these are 1870 dollars worth millions of dollars today. This is a very large salary compared to the mere $10,000 paid to the vice president or the $7,500 paid to cabinet members or senators or congressmen, or the mere $50,000 paid to even the President of the United States. Now, the collector, the lucky person holding this job back in the 1870s, was the man on your left with the stylish side whiskers and the nice fur coat. His name is Chester Alan Arthur. Arthur was a career politician. By all accounts, he was a very nice person, very friendly person. He had been an abolitionist lawyer before the Civil War, was a quartermaster during the war. But since the Civil War, he had been a Republican politician, moved up through the ranks until he got this job. But Arthur, while he was the boss of the Customs House, the collector of the Customs House, he was not the boss of the New York political machine. That was the man on your right with the beard. His name is Roscoe Conkling. He was the senior senator from New York. As such, he controlled the patronage, he controlled the jobs, he controlled who had what rank. Conkling had a particularly prickly personality, very authoritarian figure, someone who held grudges, a very good speaker, very funny and sarcastic. He's someone who, if he lived today, would be very good on talk radio or cable TV. But at the time, he was the boss. In October 1877, the system got turned on its head. Now remember, Garfield's going to be elected in 1880. We're now talking late 1877, so one is coming just before the other. The president at this moment, at this time, was Rutherford B. Hayes from Ohio. Hayes was a very reform-minded person. He was very concerned about the corruption in government. There have been many scandals during the Grant era that he had pledged to crack down on. So earlier that year, he ordered an investigation of corruption at the New York Custom House. Sure enough, the report came back and they found that there was a heck of a lot of corruption at the Custom House. So in October, in response to that corruption, Arthur took the very public step of firing Chester Alan Arthur, very publicly. In this cartoon, you see him kicking him out of the building. He had the power to do that, and he named a replacement, this man. Well, the picture shows him looking very, very stern. In real life, he was also a very friendly person. His name is Theodore Roosevelt Sr. That name may ring a bell. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. in 1877 was a very prominent businessman in New York. He was a leader of many of the reform efforts, reform clubs. His goal was to bring honesty and merit to the Custom House. This obviously was seen as a threat to Roscoe Conkling, who controlled the Custom House as the custom patronage in order to support his machine. So as a result, this was considered a major blow, major embarrassment to both Arthur and Conkling vowed to fight it. As a senator, he went back to Washington. He invoked the principle of senatorial courtesy. He said, I, as a senior senator from New York, certainly do not approve of this appointment. It was a big public fight. Roosevelt's name came up for a vote finally, and he was defeated on a vote of 31 to 25. This was a major embarrassment now for Roosevelt and for Rutherford Hayes. Within days of that vote, Roosevelt collapsed in his home in New York City. 2 months later, he died at 46 years old. The cause of his death never properly diagnosed because this was the 1870s. But most people most of his family members and friends felt that his death had been caused by the stress and embarrassment of this fight over the Custom House. There were three immediate effects of this fight. For one thing, Chester Alan Arthur, now out of a job, took a job as the chairman of the New York State Republican Committee, which made him formally Roscoe Conkling's functionary running the party. Second, Hayes, who had been politically wounded by this and a number of other factors, announced that he was not going to run for re-election, which created a big opening for someone new to come in. And third, Theodore Roosevelt at this point had a 19-year-old son named Theodore Roosevelt Jr., who was very close to his father and watched this whole affair unfold from a very close vantage point, and this would shape him very much. I promise we are going to get Theodore Roosevelt Jr. back into the story before we're finished. So this is the backstory. This is the environment in which James Garfield entered the national stage in 1880. At this point, James Garfield was a congressman from Ohio. He had a very nice life. He was a very well-respected man. His colleagues in Congress had appointed him to almost every important post in the Congress. He had been chairman of the Banking Committee, chairman of the Appropriations Committee, a party leader. The legislature in Ohio had actually voted to approve him as a senator in the coming year. He had a very nice wife, Lucretia, a nice family, and a nice farm in Mentor, Ohio. Garfield was as ambitious as anyone else in Washington, but he had never really made a move to throw his hat in the ring for president. In 1880, he attended the Republican National Convention, not as a candidate, but as a campaign manager for somebody else. That somebody else was John Sherman, the former senator from Ohio, who was then serving as Secretary of the Treasurer under Rutherford Hayes. Garfield would go to the convention and give the nominating speech for John Sherman. But lightning would strike, as we're about to see, and James Garfield would be thrown into the center of the political storm that was about to break. So very briefly, because this is a complicated slide, the Republican nominating convention in Chicago in 1880 was one of those classic conventions. It went for 36 ballots, which makes it the longest ever Republican convention. There were some Democratic conventions that went longer. One of them made it to 104 ballots, but the Democrats up in that period had a 2/3 rule. You needed a 2/3 majority to be elected, to be nominated as president. The Republicans simply used a majority system. In 1880, it was a three-way race, and I'll walk through this very quick. The leading candidate was General Ulysses Grant. You see him in the middle of the cartoon, still in his uniform. Grant was the choice. He was backed by a group of senators led by our own Roscoe Conkling, who we've been talking about, who felt that their power over patronage and political power in Washington had been lessened during the Rutherford Hayes years. And they were using General Grant as a vehicle to restore their authority, to restore their control. They had been high-ranking people during the first Grant term. Grant entered the convention with about 300 votes in his control. His chief opponent was this man in the middle, the one taking down the flag, and this is James Gillespie Blaine. We could talk hours about Blaine. He's one of the very interesting people of this era. For our purposes today, he was the main opponent. He controlled about 290 votes. The third candidate was John Sherman. Here you see him next to Blaine helping take down that third-term flag. Sherman, as I mentioned, was a former senator from Ohio. He was serving in the Rutherford Hayes administration, and Garfield was his campaign manager. When the convention started, they started voting on the candidates. For the first 34 ballots, the three sides held firm. About 300 for Grant, about 290 for Blaine, about 80 to 90 for Sherman. Ballot after ballot, hour after hour, roll call after roll call, until the delegates, after several days of this, were getting very tired and looking for a way. On the 34th ballot at the very end, when they got to the W's to the state of Wisconsin, 16 Wisconsin delegates decided to try to break the deadlock by announcing their votes for James Garfield. Garfield was on the convention floor at the time with the Ohio delegation. He got recognition from the chairman. said, Mr. Chairman, I am not a candidate. I do not want these votes. I reject them. To which the chairman said, essentially, Mr. Garfield, you are out of order. And he ignored his motion. As a result, on the 36th ballot, there was a stampede for Garfield. All the Blaine votes, all the Sherman votes went to Garfield. The only ones that didn't were the 300 odd votes for Grant. At the end of the day, Garfield won the nomination, but he needed a way to make peace with the Grant supporters in order to make peace in the party and have the strongest chance for election. So the Garfield's circle, his friends, reached out to Roscoe Conkling and his friends from New York. They asked him, what can we do to make peace? Can we give you the choice for vice president? And anyone you offer, we will accept. The person they offered was our friend, Chester Alan Arthur. So the election of 1880 turned out to be a contest between the Republican ticket, James Garfield, with his good friend, James Blaine, who we would appoint as Secretary of State, paired with Chester Alan Arthur, the recently fired collector of the Port of New York, who is obedient and in debt to his mentor, Roscoe Conkling, the senator from New York. The race turned out to be a very close one. The Democrats nominated Winfield Scott Hancock, Civil War hero of Gettysburg. The popular vote was very, very close. When Garfield won, moved out to Washington, suddenly all the thousands of job seekers descended on him. All the different factions claimed their share of the patronage. Within a couple of weeks, that big loose end issue from the Hayes administration came to the fore, what to do about the New York customhouse. Conkling insisted that the New York party, that he as the New York senator, controlled that decision, that Conkling should hold veto power over the choice for the New York customhouse. Garfield should pick someone that Conkling approves of. On the other side, James Blaine and many of the reform elements in the party were urging Garfield to say no, that the Custom House was an important financial institution that belonged to the federal government. It had had a history of corruption. It was important that it be controlled by the national government, by an independent candidate. Garfield, after some heavy hemming and hawing, decided to take a stand, take a controversial stand. He nominated this person. You probably don't recognize him. He's largely forgotten to history, which is a shame. His name is William H. Robertson. Robertson was a middle echelon politician in New York. He was a state senator and judge from Westchester County, but he was from the Theodore Roosevelt Sr. wing of the party. He was known as a reformer. He had an outlook similar to Roosevelt. He had had several run-ins with Conkling over the years. He was someone who was known to be independent. Garfield nominated him over the direct objections of Conkling. Conkling correctly saw him as a threat, as someone who would use his power to undermine Conkling's political machine. And so he decided to fight it. The ensuing fight between Garfield and Conkling over the Robertson nomination became one of the signature defining events of those 4 months of the Garfield administration. It was a big public affair. The Senate itself stalemated for weeks over the Robertson nomination. Garfield withdrew every other nomination except Robertson to assure that Conkling could not cheat and get a vote on other people before voting on Robertson. It went on for weeks. It became very dirty. Conkling and Arthur together met with newspaper reporters and said that Garfield had promised them this piece of patronage. They had promised him the nomination. Garfield denied this, and Conkling and Arthur called him a liar in so many words, called him a cheater. Now, imagine that, the Vice President of the United States calling his own president a cheater and a liar in a political fight with one of his rivals. Garfield dug in his heels. He said things like, it had better be known whether the president is the head of the government or the registrant clerk of the Senate. The way this was perceived by the public was not very pretty. This is a cartoon from Puck magazine, one of my favorites of that era. This is not the New York Stock Exchange. It is the patronage exchange called US Senate. Here you see all the venal-looking US senators arguing, haggling for their piece of the political spoils. At the center are Arthur as the vice president and Roscoe Conkling. Conkling finally realized he could not stop the vote forever, and he would probably lose when it came. So he decided to resign in protest. It was a shocking moment within the Washington political community, but it blew over very quickly. This cartoon, that the caption says, a harmless explosion. Within days after Conkling basically threw in the towel and resigned, Robertson finally got his vote, and his nomination was approved very easily. All of which brings us back to Charles Guiteau. Like I said, I was going to take you in a roundabout story, and I'm almost 40 minutes into it, and I'm first getting to Charles Guiteau. I'll just say very quickly, Charles Guiteau was about 39 years old in 1880 at the time of these events. He was a drifter, a lawyer, an insurance salesman, a preacher, never successful at any of these things. In 1880, he was at loose ends in Boston. Like other people, he followed the exciting Republican convention in Chicago. He came to New York to participate in the campaign, thinking this may be a way to get a job. He went to the Republican committee offices. He met Chester Alan Arthur, a friendly man who treated him well. He gave a couple of speeches. After Election Day, he came down to Washington and pestered anyone he could find about getting a government job. He eventually decided that the one he wanted was to be consul, in other words, head of the American consulate in Paris, France. Not a bad choice. He had no diplomatic experience. He had never been to France. He didn't speak French. But remember, this is the spoils system. So having actual qualifications mattered a little, but not that much. He met with Garfield. He met Blaine several times, pushing for a job. Finally, right around the time, literally within a couple of days, of Roscoe Conkling throwing in the towel in embarrassment and resigning from the Senate, right around that exact time, Guiteau finally got his answer. He went to see James Blaine at one of those open meetings that cabinet members had, mentioned the Paris consulate. Blaine snapped, "Never speak to me of this again." Guiteau got his answer. Within a couple of days after that, again, all of these events are happening simultaneously. People are reacting to them in real time. Guiteau very much identified, having lost his chance for a job, he identified with the Roscoe Conkling, Chester Arthur crowd and Congress. These were his friends, the people he thought of as his leaders. Around this time, Guiteau was living in a rooming house in Washington. He lived in 3 or 4 rooming houses during this time. Yes, it's true, he would wait until the rent was due and then skip out the day before. He did that 3 or 4 times. One night he woke up in the middle of the night. He described the scene in his testimony at his murder trial, and had an epiphany that Garfield must be removed. That was the word he used, removed, a very antiseptic term, for the good of the country and the party. If Garfield were removed, Arthur would be president. All would be made right in the patronage world of New York and Washington. Guiteau could get his job. Conkling could get his control of the customhouse. Things would be made right. Guiteau went out and bought a gun. He didn't have one at that time. A few days later, he followed Garfield to the train station and shot him in the back. When he was marched off to prison, he announced, "I am a stalwart and Arthur will be president." He had sent several letters to newspapers making the same point. During his trial, his meetings with Arthur came out. In the public eye, this tied the whole thing together. Conkling, Garfield, Guiteau, the whole rotten spoils system. Arthur, for his part, was watching all this and was somewhat appalled by it. By the time Garfield died, 2 months later, he was very popular. Yes, it's true, the doctors examined him without washing their hands or their instruments, and Garfield died of infection and blood poisoning. His body had actually formed a cyst around the bullet. He would have lived had they actually just left him alone, washed the wound, tended him, and fed him. He probably wouldn't be able to walk, but he would have survived. But he was very popular. Over 100,000 people came to see him Lion State in the Capitol Rotunda, um, as they did in Cleveland for his actual funeral. People alive today would be shocked by the fact that we have so much forgotten him today. I'll very quickly wrap up. This is George Pendleton, senator from Ohio. He had had a bug in his bonnet about civil service for many years. He had introduced a bill to create a civil service system. It languished for years until after the Garfield shooting, at which point people were so appalled at the recent events that his bill passed with an overwhelming majority. Once the bill passed, it had to be signed into law by the president. The president in 1883 was now Chester Alan Arthur, the recently deposed head of the New York Custom House, protege of Roscoe Conkling. Arthur was under a lot of pressure to veto the bill. Many people assumed he would veto the bill because of his own background. There were big arguments over this. There were massive falling outs. Roscoe Conkling and Arthur had a big face-to-face shouting match over it. They broke after this and never spoke to each other again. But in 1883, Arthur, the biggest practitioner of the spoils system, signed a bill into law. Finally, I bring you back to this fellow. After Arthur signed the Civil Service Bill, not much happened. Most politicians hoped it would just go away. They tried to slow walk it until 1889. President Benjamin Harrison came to town. He had just been elected. He owed a lot of political favors, and several people in New York suggested this bright young man ought to be given a shot. Harrison decided that he would offer him something, but in this backwater commission over the civil service. Roosevelt, obviously because of his relation with his father, had very strong opinions on this subject. He took the job, he used it very effectively, insisted that the law be followed, and pushed for its implementation. By the 1890s, over 80% of the federal workforce had been placed into under the merit systems. It was one of the most successful government reforms of the 19th century. Since that time, the size of the workforce has grown and shrunk over the years. By the end of World War II, it had reached just over 3 million people. Today, it dropped after the war, but crept back up. Today, there are about 3 million federal employees. Strikingly, out of that number, and this includes postal workers, so the number is a little bit inflated, only 4,000 today are actual political appointees. That includes the people who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. It includes the Schedule Cs. It includes the non-career FCS. Only about 4,000 are actual federal employees. The rest are under the civil service in various forms. How will this change over the coming years? The jury's out. But I hope by giving you this kind of background, understanding where it came from, it will be helpful in following the story. So I thank you for being patient with me, letting me talk a little bit at length to give you a different view of Garfield and the civil service. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ken. That certainly is a wonderful history lesson. You can stop sharing so that people can see you for this quick conversation. As you've worked on civil service reform in 1978, do you see any parallels to the conversations that were going on during Garfield's time in 1978 and what may be going on now as we take an understanding of looking at the federal government workforce?
Absolutely, there were similarities. The tension between a president and leading political figures wanting loyalty as the chief attribute of people in the government, having people in the government report directly to them, as opposed to the need of the country to have a professional workforce, people who report to the public at large. That tension has been there throughout. Um, it has come under pressure throughout. What we're seeing today under the Doge initiative, it's not that dissimilar to tensions that broke out during the 1930s and the New Deal, when President Roosevelt tried to assert his will over the bureaucracy. In fact, the legal precedent that allows Congress to create regulatory agencies where the president cannot fire the commissioners, that legal precedent goes back to Franklin Roosevelt, the so-called Humphreys executor case from 1935. So yes, these tensions have been there throughout, and there are definitely parallels to what we're seeing today.
And if you were going to say, what is the one thing you mentioned that, Garfield sort of ranks in the middle of people's perspective about, what kind of president they were. And because he was really only president for such a short period of time, due to being assassinated, what do you wish people knew about President Garfield?
I guess what I wish people knew was how much how much potential he had. Garfield was someone who embodied the idealistic, the idealism of the original Republican Party. He was a true believer in the Civil War and emancipation and Reconstruction. He was someone who, had he had the chance to live, could have potentially made a real impact in trying to undo the harm of the ending of Reconstruction. He was a believer in these things. Um, we forget that presidents are human, that their lives are so fragile. What I wish people would remember was the reality of what he actually did accomplish during those 4 months. It was no small matter.
Well, we're close to our time. And so as we come to the end of our time, maybe the question is, what is the lesson about public service that Garfield's life, would remind us as we move forward?
I'll answer it this way. What always struck me about Garfield was he lived in a period when the people around him were very venal. There was the level of corruption in the country in the 1870s and 1880s was very high. We were not far removed from the Tweed Ring in New York City. We were not far removed from the Grant scandals in Washington. Garfield was surrounded by very grasping, aggressive people, but he himself was a very decent, honest person. And he showed that you could function as president. You could function in a very difficult political situation with strong personalities on every side, but do it in a kind way, in a gentle way. He once said in his diary, he was complaining about some fight he was in the middle of, and he said, "I am not a good hater." He said that almost regretfully, because so many people around him were. But it showed that you didn't have to be a good hater in order to be an effective political character, even in a very difficult time.
And final moment. There's a query now about whether the Pendleton Act is really an unconstitutional imposition into the president's power to have people of his own choosing by Congress. Has that matter ever been litigated?
The Pendleton Act itself, I don't think has been litigated. Whether having a civil service system at all has been is unconstitutional. The Constitution, I'm just going to pull up a note so I say this correctly. Um, the Constitution lays out the executive branch. It says that what are called inferior offices, these are the rank and file federal employees. Inferior offices will be chosen by the president alone or heads of departments as Congress provides. So the Constitution does give Congress a potential voice in laying out the ground rules for those appointments. Whether a test case on this coming up before this Supreme Court would find that there are limits on that authority is a very good question. One of the striking things about the period we're living in is that many of these fundamental assumptions are being set up as test cases. I mentioned Humphrey's executors is a likely test case. The ability of the president to fire members of regulatory commissions, even though the statutes clearly say they cannot be fired except for cause or bad actions. That will clearly be litigated. This one may well be too. We're already seeing many of the firings of federal employees being tested in court. How these will all turn out, the jury's still out.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot of background as we watch the events coming upon us. We are grateful, very, very grateful for you, Ken, for your conversation. And we will have this has been recorded and it will be available on our website. So anyone who has enjoyed the conversation, please, feel free to share it. We look forward to our next conversations coming up. We're looking ahead. You can see we will be talking with Professor Erwin Treminsky, who is looking at the faults in the Constitution. It's often been said, will our democracy last forever? And he's going to address that question on Thursday, May 8th. And then on May 29th, we're going to talk about Civil War in Statuary Hall with author Jean Schmel. So look ahead to May for interesting conversations and interesting history, continuing as a result of the support from our friends and members. We thank you again. We are so grateful for your support and your caring about Capitol history and the true values of this country. We are grateful to each of you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ken. Enjoy the rest of your day. Be well. Goodbye.
Thank you.